evidence? Well, we'd expect to find evidence of rapid erosion where the water currents ripped up the rock layer underneath. That was rapid and catastrophic, and we see that exactly at the base, at the bottom of the Tapete sandstone, where the rock layers underneath were ripped off and the sandstone was formed very rapidly. In fact, these beds in the Tapete sandstone are just the same as beds of sand that are deposited after hurricanes. And we find in the base of the Tapete sandstone boulders. Some of these boulders are huge, up to 19 feet across, rapidly flowing water currents, and they rapidly eroded everything underneath and then deposited this sandstone bed. So there was rapid erosion in that instance. And then sometimes we find evidence of local rapid erosion between rock layers. For example, at the base of the Redwall limestone, we find underneath, the limestone underneath, there's been channels cut rapidly and another limestone deposited in there. But here's the one I like the best, where you have knife-edge boundaries between rock layers, which is often the norm. Now you think about it. If a rock layer is deposited, then it's sitting out there for millions of years before the next rock layer is deposited on top of it. What would you expect to happen? You'd expect the soil to form, you'd expect erosion, you'd get gullies, you'd get an uneven topography over millions of years, supposedly. Well, how many millions of years are there between the Coconino Sandstone and the Hermit Shale? Look at that perfect knife-edge boundary, absolutely flat from one end of the Grand Canyon to the other. Not even a hint of any millions of years between. It was continuous, rapid deposition. Here's another example of the rapid succession of the strata, of the rock layers. Folding of whole rock layer sequences without fracturing. Let me explain to you what I mean. Have you ever tried to bend a rock? A hard, solid rock. Yeah, you try to bend it. Can you do it easily? Not very easily. I have to usually subject rocks to punishment by hitting them with a hammer. And what happens? Because it is hard and brittle, it fractures, it shatters. So if you try to bend a rock and it's hard, it's going to snap. Okay. Well, how do you explain this in the Grand Canyon? That's the Tapete sandstone, where the sandstone has been bent through 90 degrees. And it's not the only rock layer. You can go up another side canyon from the Colorado River, you can see the Redwall limestone, the Muave limestone, all the rock layers above are all bent in the same 90-degree angle. Now, do you see any fracturing there? You go up nice and close and it's actually smooth. The bend is nice and smooth. Now how would you bend a rock like that? Well, the scientists, the conventional scientists, oh, it's so simple. You bury it down deep enough, and under the pressure and heat, the heat and the pressure will cause it to bend slowly. Well, what they forget to tell you is that the heat and pressure will also metamorphose the sandstone and turn it into another rock. So when we look at that, do we see a rock that's been affected by heat and pressure? Absolutely not. It's the same sandstone as everywhere else in the Grand Canyon. So, how would you bend a sandstone? When it's still soft, when it's still wet, just after it's been deposited. You'd bend it because it's still wet and it's still plastic. It's like having clay, modelling clay, before it dries out. It's still soft and plastic and you can bend it. Okay? So now you understand how that would form. But here's the problem. Not for you and me, but for the conventional geologist with his millions of years. Why? Because the whole rock sequence making up the walls of the Grand Canyon was supposedly laid down over 300 million years. After 300 million years, the Tapete sandstone was down the bottom of over 4,000 feet of other rock layers. And then 480 million years after the Tapete sandstone was buried, the earth movements caused that bending. Well, do you think that the Tapete sandstone would be still soft and plastic after 480 million years buried under 4,000 feet of strata? No. He's got a real problem. Let's put it like this. The Tapete sandstone was supposedly deposited 550 million years ago. Other rock layers were laid on top to the rim of the Grand Canyon over 300 million years, so that 250 million years ago the last rock layer was deposited. And then 70 million years ago, 480 million years after the Tapete sandstone was deposited, we had this bending, this earth movement that pushed up the rock layers and bent them. But the Tapete sandstone is folded as though it is still soft from being deposited 480 million years earlier. What does that tell us? The 480 million years never existed. Well, one last example. Polystrate fossils. That is, fossils which require multiple rock layers to bury them. Poly means many, straight means layers. Many layers, fossils. That means fossils that go up through many layers. And the best way to show you is to give you examples. Here from Newcastle, just north of Sydney, on the east coast of Australia, you can see on the left there a photograph of two coal seams, two coal beds. On the right is a cartoon diagram with labels on it to help you understand what you see. Sitting on top of the bottom coal bed, you see two tree stumps. In fact, you can see another tree stumps on the horizon poking up through the top coal bed. When these fossils were first found, 100 years ago this year in fact, these tree stumps went all the way from the bottom coal bed right up through the top coal bed. In between are four layers of volcanic ash. By the way, the geologists say the coal beds were formed slowly in a swamp. These trees happen to be pine trees that can't grow in swamps. And they're trees that don't have any roots on them. The roots have been broken off. Sounds a bit to me like what happened at Mount St Helens. And in fact, this is a perfect example of exactly what you'd expect to find on the bottom of Spirit Lake at Mount St Helens. The peat forming on the bottom of Mount St Helens, tree stumps sinking vertically, being buried in volcanic ash. It's going through many rock layers that couldn't have taken millions of years to form. In fact, if the conventional geologists are correct, these pine trees that don't grow in swamps, that don't have any roots on them, must have been sitting on top of this swamp, buried by all these volcanic ash beds, and then had thousands of years of another swamp and survived still to be sticking up through the top. You see how easy it is to argue that you only needed rapid deposition of these rock layers, including the coal beds, otherwise these pine trees would not have been preserved in this upright position. Joggins, Nova Scotia, on the far eastern of Canada, we find hundreds of these vertical trees, stumps, poking up through many layers. Let me give you the details. These upright fossil trees penetrate 20 geological horizons through 2,500 feet. And that implies that all these 2,500 feet of strata had to bury these trees rapidly before they could rot. Well, does it really matter whether we believe in Noah's flood or not? You know, some Christians say, this is just too divisive and controversial. Let's just concentrate on presenting the gospel message. But remember, Jesus said, "For had ye believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote of me. But if ye believe not his writings, how shall you believe my words?" And Jesus, we said before, referred to Noah. He referred to the flood. And Jesus said, if you don't believe what Moses wrote about the flood, how are you going to believe what I'm telling you? We need to remind you again that there was no bloodshed and death of soulish or nephesh life prior to the fall. Adam and Eve weren't walking on in a garden that was full of dinosaur fossils underneath their feet. God saw everything that he'd made, and behold, it was very good. How does God measure goodness? Jesus said there's none good but God. God's creation was perfect. There was no death or evidence of death, suffering or violence in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve walked in it before the fall and the curse. And they were all vegetarians to begin with. I'm just giving you a revision, aren't I? You're revising your knowledge of Genesis. And the fall affected the whole creation. You'll see where I'm leading in a moment. We're told that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. It's been subjected because of man's rebellion and the curse that followed. What is the implication of what Genesis is teaching us here? The implication is that if there was no death of soulish or soul-bearing creatures, no bloodshed before the fall, then there could have been no fossils formed before the fall, and thus no fossils in the ground prior to the creation of Adam and Eve. But of course, evolutionary geology insists that there were countless fossils buried in rock layers formed over millions and millions, in fact at least 500 million years before man supposedly arrived. We've got two diametrically opposed belief systems here. You see, that's why the evidence matters. That's why understanding the geological evidence that teaches that Noah's flood really did occur. Because whose view is correct? That of God the Creator who was there, who has told us what he did, confirmed by the testimony of Jesus Christ, or that of the fallible scientists who were not there? You see, as I close, if the biblical record is literally correct, then most of the fossils formed during the flood, and there never were 500 million years, and the earth is therefore young, just as the Bible teaches. Thank you.